You gotta have a podcast.
You gotta have a podcast. You gotta have a podcast.
You gotta have a podcast.
You gotta have a podcast.
You gotta have a podcast.
You gotta have a podcast.
You gotta have a podcast.
You gotta have a podcast.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to You Gotta Have a Podcast. It's me, your host, Angela Palladino, back with another episode for you today. Hope everybody's having a great week, and thank you again for tuning in. Today, I have a lovely conversation with a friend of mine from the comedy community who was formerly a scientist before becoming a science communicator and a storyteller, digital media freelancer, and comedian. That's where I met her, on comedy stages in New York City, but it turns out she's done so much more than that. From scientific fieldwork in Egypt and Spain to graduate studies in the UK, she's been all over the world, and she came right back to New York City where she started with a huge story to tell along the way. Her name is Kyle Marian, and she produces and performs in shows that celebrate diverse voices. We get really deep into it, and we laugh a lot along the way. Here is my conversation with Kyle Marian. Chicken or the egg question, which came first? Science or comedy?
Always the egg. But also, technically it is the egg because dinosaurs, but also it was science for me.
Yeah.
I never thought I was funny. I never thought I was creative. English writing classes were torture for me because there wasn't like a clear formula or answers. And I was always that kind of person growing up. I really enjoyed calculus. I really enjoyed being able to problem solve stuff because that felt logical. And so, growing up, I was always kind of attracted more towards the science and the maths kind of stuff. And that's what I followed sort of in college and then grad school. So I ended up doing a degree in anthropology, which is a social science, but largely because I was like, oh, I want to try archaeology because, that's like a science where you can travel the world and be paid for it, right? Like in Indiana Jones. So I was just like, I'm going to try that instead and see what that's like. And that kind of led me to the trajectory of the sciences in general.
That's really cool. I mean, who doesn't want to be Indiana Jones, right?
Looking back now, I'm just like, yes, definitely want to be a white man who can't get fired from his job, even though he skips his job to go on vacation. Okay, that
but
makes
he's
sense.
A renegade, Kyle.
He's a renegade. For sure. Also, the American dream for me, which is a white man. That is, growing up, definitely.
I mean, if you get to pick.
Yeah, exactly. If I get to pick, it's not necessarily an Asian immigrant woman. Yeah.
If playing on easy mode would be a white man, American man. Cool. So what was that experience like when you were pursuing the archaeological aspects and also anthropology, where you're traveling a lot more and not necessarily being, because I know you've done a lot of work outside the US.
Yeah.
In the UK and stuff. Did that work come from those first sort of tastes into doing sort of the more international?
So it's kind of interesting because if the career path to becoming sort of a professional archaeologist or paleontologist, that is always international. And there's actually nowadays, 21st century, looking back and people doing a lot of thinking around how colonizing that is and that mentality in the sciences where you get money from the Western society or the Northern hemisphere and bring it to a developing nation, but then you take control of all of that knowledge afterwards. There's a whole world of thinking now that's reshifting that. But when I was starting out, it was very much this is a career path that would allow me as a Filipino immigrant to sort of go back to my roots and really understand, okay, what was the first peopling of the Philippines and Southeast Asia? How did that come to be? Why am I so similar to my friends who are Indonesian and our languages are so similar? Like, all of those little like social things sparked that question for me growing up. And ironically, to the disappointment of my AP calculus teacher, Mr. Leung, in high school, where he was like, one day was asking me after we got our exam results back, and he was like, Kyle, you're amazing at calculus and you seem to love the math stuff. What are you going to do, for college? And I was like, I signed up for anthropology. And he was just like, how dare you?
A social science?
A social science?
How dare you?
I have never felt that level of shame from a teacher before, but like, it was really funny because that also weirdly,
sorry, Mr. Leung.
I know, sorry. I'm so sorry, Mr. Leung. But that like weirdly got me into that pathway of like, okay, as a career, I feel like this sparks my curiosity, but also helps me connect back to my roots as a Filipino, and like all of these questions of similarities that I see with, my friends growing up who are Indonesian, Malaysian, that sort of thing. Even starting with language, where like, my Indonesian friends who I played volleyball with would say things like salamat, or like, but there's like this almost the same exact words in Filipino and that sort of thing. And like that helped spark that sort of momentum of asking that question of who am I? How are we so similar? How are people, different, but still kind of the same in so many ways? And that led me to that trajectory. But also in terms of choosing, sort of deciding, oh, okay, like I kind of want to follow this up, like this idea of human evolution and, traveling the world to understand how we became to be. That kind of really solidified my choices in college and then like applying for grad school. But around that time too, I was pretty lucky because like I grew up in New York City and like my mom worked at NYU. And so going to college at New York University was pretty much free because of tuition remission. And that allowed me opportunities to save up my money from working to then apply to like travel and all of that other stuff, which is actually really costly. Like, there's a reason that whole world and a lot of the sciences is still largely like you have to have money behind you. You have to have kind of a well enough family to you to like choose that kind of pathway. Like I would have had to pay $4,000 to spend 1 month in Egypt to learn how to excavate and study Egyptology. Like that's just how much it was. And like my choices of ending up working in Spain with colleagues from the American Museum of Natural History, because I happened to know the right person who helped me like get an internship there. Like that was an opportunity that like I chose because it was free. And I just had to like pay for my own flight, but didn't have to like lock down $4,000 as a college student working 2 jobs to like be able to afford that opportunity for my career. So like there were all of these like economic layers to that. That I was like, okay, this is really hard to achieve, but also I found ways to sort of give it a try and like gain the momentum that led me to grad school. And actually like applying for grants that would support, being a grad student and like all of that stuff. But
So you were able to, in some small ways, like start to explore, what's the right word? Like field work essentially in undergrad.
I was.
That's great.
Like I had a really big experience like my senior year where I had the opportunity where I was taking classes in forensics and like and bone and anthropology in that sense, like physical anthropology. And at that same time, the World Trade Center sifting project was just kind of finishing up. Like this was like years after 9/11, but New York City was still sifting through all of that debris for all that time. Like, that area underneath Dumbo, like directly underneath like that area between where the Timeout marketplace is now, St. Anne's. like there was a spot there before it was fully developed where it was just a massive warehouse. And that was where we were sifting all of that debris. And so like I had opportunities like in New York City to be able to apply some of the field knowledge without necessarily leaving the country and paying all of that stuff. And like that was what got me really into the fieldwork part. It was like the classes I was taking plus the practical work that I was doing to be like, yeah, this feels fulfilling. I'm applying like the weird puzzling of bones that I learned in class to like helping families reconnect and like, you know, finish, you know, find like closure with like this massive thing that happened to all of us in New York City.
Yeah. It does sound, now maybe this comparison is not appropriate, but it sound like there's some similarities as far as barriers, especially economic barriers between like this type of science, like especially things that require field work and require a lot of money behind it. And also like a lot of the arts, like, right. Like, you know, you talk to like, for example, like actors or painters, like needing grants to like do their work, and like same thing with science. I mean, vastly different. And you know, what's funny to me though, is that people always say about like when it comes to the arts, like, well, you know, artists get taken advantage of because they'll do it for free. You know, and I feel, do you feel like it might be the same sort of mentality around some of the sciences where people are just like, if you could like just do it for free, you would? Absolutely. The sciences and education. Like, it's because it's a passionate thing, I feel.
It is, but also people don't see the capitalist value immediately. Do you know what I mean? Like they don't see the monetary influence. When I'm talking to a lot of scientists these days about like, you know, what we call foundational or basic science, which is like, you know, at first glance, it feels like science for the sake of knowledge, just so we can know, put it in a textbook and that sort of thing. But it actually, like, you know, maybe would impact massive applied science stuff like, hey, the mRNA vaccines, like 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line. But if you're just talking to a regular person to show them that, like, okay, teaching someone how to do things or like doing that kind of research matters, they assume that you should be able to do all that work for like pennies, right? Because they don't have that immediate value to their lives. And it's and I agree. It's the same with the arts. It's like, you should be, it's fulfilling to you, right? But it doesn't connect with like, okay, well, how am I able to pay my bills as an artist? But like someone on the other end who's like, okay, well, why am I helping you pay your bills? This is just like for fun, right? Like, it's a totally different thing, but it is a huge barrier to like being able to succeed, or if you don't have the right background to actually try it out. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I was not expecting to like sort of, I've never really thought of that before, but that like makes a lot of sense. There's no immediate visible way that it's like you're immediately making money from, for example, anthropological research. So where in the mix, where in the map of all this time were you starting to start to realize the importance of like science communication? And then from that, you know, how you've gotten into like the more like storytelling and comedy elements of how you incorporate that together?
So I have always really enjoyed kind of teaching and sort of facilitating conversations with groups. Weirdly, I had experience in high school where they were trying to, you know, like those leadership kinds of things where they teach you how to like get your other classmates to talk about a topical issue and that sort of thing. Like that kind of sparked that a little bit, but it's funny because like the practical side of teaching didn't really happen until grad school, where like that was part of my PhD program was, you know, I get paid, but then at the same time as doing like the studies and the research, I also had to teach. And I found that like there was a time where I was teaching human gross anatomy to first year med students, PAs, physician assistants and nurses, et cetera. And like I really enjoyed helping them not fail because I had failed that class once.
Yeah.
And then I was like, why am I not internalizing all of this things that I had to memorize? And I ended up being like the go-to tutor that like the professors would recommend me to students who were like near failing so that I could help them just like actually internalize some of that knowledge. And I really enjoyed that because I felt like, you know, I was able to help them figure out how the information made sense for them. So it was like very much, you know, a one-on-one thing. And I could like figure out, okay, this analogy works for you or this analogy doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
But there were also times in field work in Spain where like we would have these open days where families from like the neighboring towns would come watch us like as if we were in a zoo, and like they would watch us like doing our thing and point at us and stuff. And we would like show them the little like stone tools or whatever that we're finding. And there were moments there where like we would be telling them, you know, this is what's going on. And I would like, as someone who's like sort of had learned Spanish, but then don't have that in-depth knowledge, was like tasked with, hey, this is a foreigner, go, you know, be our like shining guide. Cause like, that's a neat thing. Our team is international.
Yeah.
But then I would be met with like these elderly folks who are just like, why are you destroying the hills I grew up in? Now I can't show my kids what this hill is beautiful for. What?
It's all taped off.
It's all taped off. You're digging it away. The hills are disappearing. And for what? To put something in a damn museum?
Yeah.
And it's like that sort of thing where I was just like, oh, okay. How am I going to like help that? How am I going to fix that?
Yeah.
You know, like, how am I going to be like, yeah, this is, you know, important stuff. It helps us understand like human heritage and like, you know, what the world looked like 500,000 years ago. But then to like a regular person, they're just like, no, you're digging holes. Why does that matter? And so like that challenge is also like, okay, there are other things that are at play with like how important it is to storytell or like how to converse with people who, you know, you're in their territory, you're in their land and history. Like, what does it mean to like actually engage with them and like show them why what we're doing is also beneficial for them, or for me to understand why what I'm doing as a scientist is harmful to them. Like that's the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
And so like that got me into sort of really trying to figure out, what are the opportunities here for her communicating science or my research beyond just like talking to like academics that like, oh, here are the cool stuff that I kind of did and didn't learn.
Right.
Yeah. And like I had the opportunity at the program that I was in grad school where they were just coming up with a training program for scientists. Alan Alda like built this entire program, and this is now what he does. I know this is now what he does, but like he started at Stony Brook with this idea that like, dang, scientists suck at talking to people. Why? This is a problem. And then as an actor, he's like, let me teach them the ways. Let me teach them how to improvise. And like that kind of got me started into sort of unpacking, okay, what am I missing in terms of skills as a scientist? But also like, why don't I care about who I'm talking to sometimes as a scientist? Like that was what got me started.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just to talk to you now, it does seem like a lot of your journey has been like driven by your like a lot of like your internal need to like understand and relate to people just wherever they might be in the world and whatever time period they may have lived in. And yeah, I mean, communication is obviously the first part of that. And it's so interesting too, because like you were saying, all of the work is important, but to like science and the world in general, but to someone who, for example, that hill has important memories. The hill is more important to them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the memories that they make. This is what I distinctly remember from that old Spanish man who was like, you know, the memories that I made on these hills, I can't make them with my grandchildren because of you guys. And that was major. Also, like a tiny part in my head was like, okay, Spanish colonizer, you're talking about Filipino. That feels really weird. But like, you know, like on the surface level, I was also like, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. But we should talk about history at some point. But okay, I get it.
You know what, sir? You need to think about.
There are layers here.
Yeah.
We don't have time to unpack. But
yeah. And layers beyond the sediment in the hills. That is a dirt joke for everybody out there. But that's really interesting too, because so much of your communication work probably is built on sort of putting yourself in other people's shoes, whether or not they're difficult shoes to put yourself in, and trying to like understand how they think so that you can communicate clearly with them. Does that make sense? Do you feel like that that's the case?
Yeah. And there are times where I, as a regular human who's also a woman of color, like, but also I'm not Black. Like there are times where I'm like, I do not have the bandwidth for this person to care. I need to care about them for them to care about the science, about my comedy, about anything else. And sometimes it's just understanding that like, nah, not today. Not today, old man. Yeah. But it's a huge part of like, I guess what drives me, and in my career, also what kind of snowballed into me leaving science and being like, no, I think what works better for me is to focus on the communication part. Yeah. Because there's so much wrong in the science part that I also need to sort of resolve for myself. But like that's all of those different pieces also allowed me the chance to like really sort of reckon with my own choices and like the whys of why I was drawn to science, what I was thriving in terms of like teaching and like connecting with other people, but what was also holding me back from like what I thought about myself. And, you know, like in many ways, what led to a burnout for me in like that particular career choice. Yeah. I mean, I also enjoyed interacting with scientists. Like I loved being in museums and like traveling different museums around the world to like see their collections and that sort of thing. Like that was always fun. Yeah. But a huge part of being a scientist is so siloed too. And there's a lot of structures that you have to play against, whether it's like, you know, sexism and like the glass elevator, quote unquote, where like there's, you know, people higher up are seeing there's like more women coming into the disciplines. And so they're kind of like inadvertently fast tracking cis men in that space. And like how that power dynamic and all those like internal politics really took away from like me and what I thought I was going to be able to do in the sciences. And so like there are all these pieces that kind of made science for me as a career choice really like fun and like allowed me to thrive. But then there were huge parts that were systemic that like kept that from me. And there was just a point where I was like, I can't keep trying when I'm like going uphill with a giant ball, you know, like with a giant rock, just trying to get things done. But like my morale was like not there, you know? Yeah.
So that was what contributed like significantly to the burnout you mentioned, right? Like more of that sort of emotional level, not necessarily like the work itself, but everything that surrounds it. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, Sisyphus, right? Pushing the boulder up the hill. Exactly. So then was it a hard pivot when you pivoted to more toward the communication, or was it a slowly like inching over?
Kind of both.
Yeah.
Because I was involved with the Ellen Alda Center
Right.
for Communicating Science, I had external mentors who were outside of the science and academia space, who showed me that like you have a career choice. Like, you can have multiple career lives. And when you're just in the sciences and like you kind of like, for me, I kind of was like, I'm deciding from high school onwards that this was the thing that I wanted and kept pushing forwards. You rarely get the opportunity to meet other people who have made those career leaps. And now like we know tons of people who've made those career leaps. I mean, we know like, showrunners who were former, finance analysts and like all of these like layers of, total career pivots. But at the time I needed a crisis therapist to help me sort of admit to myself that like, that is a possibility. I can value myself enough to be like, enough with this career because it's not for me. And like, I also had the help of external mentors to be like, here are the opportunities. It's totally fine. It's totally normal. And like, now is a great time to jump. And like, like have that sort of soft kind of discussion that I didn't feel safe having within the academic space. Yeah. And so like, it was both soft and like sharp kind of turn.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've had a career pivot in my career as well. And I think one of the hardest things, and maybe you relate to this, is admitting that it's okay. And that all of the work that you did do was not a waste of time. It's still useful to you. But because it's hard, especially when you're making a choice at like 18 and going to college or something. Yeah. You can't be held accountable for decisions you make at 18.
No. Come on. Although to be fair, there is one aunt where I have not honestly told her that I'm not a doctor. She still thinks that I have a PhD, and I'm like, no, I left before that. But I refuse to tell her because she's hard to please. So she still thinks I have a PhD. So
that's okay.
Yeah.
If it makes her happy and she can keep thinking that. And honestly, especially when it comes to like mental health and sort of protecting yourself so that you can do your best work and be your best self. It sounds like it was important to make that pivot and still do work that you're passionate about, but maybe in a slightly different way that's more in tune for your needs.
Yeah. I did find myself like asking, right? Like, how often do we actually get taught how to see ourselves as like we have transferable skills? Like that is that's like a big term in helping people sort of shift careers and like redesign their resumes, right? Like as an academic, I never learned how to write a 1-page resume ever. It was always like, you got to fill those 10 pages. Like you got to write every single tiny thing you've ever done. It needs to be 5 pages to 10. Otherwise, shame on you. But like, no one ever taught me how to see myself as having those transferable skills. And like, now that, I have enough years beyond, like past my academic life, I keep telling people that like, hey, it's really important for you to understand that like, all of that work sifting through data, like that is massive transferable skills that can pay you way more in like the industry outside of academia if you know how to use Excel well, like things like that where I wish that I had that kind of guidance. I didn't. So around the time of my transition, I felt like my only choice was to get a student loan and take a master's somewhere. That would help me sort of reformat my academic like career into my next steps.
I see. So you felt like you had to like, not necessarily a step backward, like take a step back to restart down. Like it's like you missed the exit, so you got to back up and like.
Pretty much. Like I needed a way to restart. And because no matter how at the time I thought I could spin my like work experience and my degree as a scientist.
Yeah.
Like I just wasn't competitive to be able to like get Nat Geo internships, or like I wasn't competitive to get an actual paying job at a museum, like because I was competing with people who knew how to write those resumes, right? And like knew how to like had the right connections or like the right people to reference for that particular role. And I just felt like, I mean, I had years of teaching, I had years of like research, but like I had zero idea how to translate that. And so I had to choose to do a master's that would help me become more of a professional science communicator.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me, because I also lean really heavily now on like those transferable skills. Like I started, especially in my like, you know, outside of comedy stuff, I started like as basically in marketing and project managing. And then going from that to, you know, working in the production industry, you know, producing is project managing, but it's the same skills. It's scheduling, budgets, all that stuff. But communicating, especially, I feel like someone like you or I might understand like, oh, it's basically the same thing. But when you're applying for those jobs, some people just see something on a resume that's a different title. And then they just like automatically are like, oh, they've never done this before. And it's so infinitely infuriating to me.
It is. Yeah. Understanding that limitation for the people reading those resumes on the other side was huge, because it was like, right, if you're just trying to transfer careers and you're just submitting your resumes everywhere, it feels like all of the no's are you. And like, that's not always the case. Like sometimes it's also the other person on the other side. And like, if you don't understand that, then it's hard to sort of fix what's wrong, right? To like adjust to the new problem. So and for me, like that meant a massive student loan. So student loans, goddamn.
Oh, I feel your pain. Actually, probably not as much, because I don't have a master's degree. But I mean, listen, I place so much value on education, and honestly, if I could, I would just be in grad school my entire life and never do anything else if it was free. But because I like learning things. But it does feel, I'm sure, like, you know, you have to like sort of take the time to go out back and do that, you know, additional degree just to pivot. What was that experience like? Like, did you feel like you were like kind of like, you know, in the waiting room to actually get started, or how did you like contextualize that experience?
Not necessarily. So at the time I was like transitioning and choosing a master's, the US didn't have any science communications programs that would certify me. So like, I was just like, I mean, I guess I could try museum studies, but like, that's not it. And so I found that like, there were programs in the UK, and that's what led me to like working and living in the UK for a couple of years. But in terms of how that felt like, it felt like Eat, Pray, Love. It felt like freedom. Like I was like, oh yeah, fuck my past life. Like I can like start refresh and like really, you know, see how I can like without the pressures of people who knew me. Like this is me restarting, and like that felt freeing, and it was so incredible. I was also living in Edinburgh, Scotland. You know, where the Fringe happens every year. And so like having those touch points also helped like unlock that creativity and like the possibilities. And the specific program that I took for my master's in science communication and public engagement also allowed us sort of rotations with different places of practice. And so that meant that I can see what it's like to apply my skills and the new skills that I'm learning to, say, you know, policy making and working with Parliament in the UK versus like working in a museum or a tourist spot. And that was really neat. And so like that like unlocked so much of going from, I don't know what's possible to like, no, literally anything is possible. Yeah. Anything is possible if I can figure out what their problem is, how they pay for it. And then I could be like, oh, this is how I see myself in that role. And so that was actually a really like freeing experience for me, because it was a chance to just feel like I could break away from my own limitations that I impose on myself, but also like to feel like I can really test this out and try this out and see what's up. Yeah.
That's really cool. There's something really magical about when you kind of like, as someone who burned their past career down and then moved to New York and didn't know anyone, I was just like, I can do fucking anything. I can be anyone. No one knows who I am, what I do. So like, I totally relate to that. And it's so funny that you were in Edinburgh. My girlfriend is originally from Edinburgh. I was just there a couple weeks ago. It's a very magical place.
It's a magical place. I can't believe you were there, around COP26? Yeah?
Well, I was there
conference?
Right before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was there in beginning of October. So, yeah.
Yeah. And like being in Scotland also was what led me to comedy. Because the UK had this program running for 10 years where they were training up scientists and academics to do like humorous talks and stand up. And like not necessarily stand up the way we do, like we know stand up in New York City or like the main stages, right? Like Comedy Central. It was more of that like British vibe of, you know, just chatting and like being funny, like and having, you know, room to like push people to see sort of what's funny about research and that sort of thing. So like that's what got me started. And like it actually, seeing one show for this place called the Bright Club in Edinburgh at their venue there called The Stand. Like the first time I was really like, oh, I need to do this for myself. Was watching a woman who had just defended her dissertation that week, like her PhD dissertation.
God bless.
And spent 8 minutes roasting like all the people that she had to deal with just to get to a place to be like, I spent 5 years of my life studying this and now I have to impress you in an hour. Are you kidding me? And like just absolutely roasted the whole system. And I was like, oh, hell yeah. Like, that's what comedy can do. I got shit to say. Oh my God. Like, this is amazing. And like, that kind of got me started on like how I can feel power and freedom through comedy. And like, also sort of unpacking a lot of like complex feelings I had about leaving science and why I left it. But also like, just like making people laugh. Like that was all sort of packaged with that. And that got me started on like using comedy specifically to educate. And that's
honestly, I mean, it's a very powerful tool. Laughter is. You can get people to bend to your will. No, but to listen to the science that you're trying to get them to listen to. So you were in Edinburgh, you were studying, what was your degree in? Like, it was science communications related, right? I missed the exact.
It was a science communication and public engagement.
Public engagement, that's it.
Which is like very technical kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it's just a catch-all for like how different types of people can actually care about science. Okay, I gotcha. And then you're in Edinburgh, you're seeing this comedy, science related comedy stuff.
Did you start yourself immediately like starting to do sort of like on stage stuff there, or did that come later?
I signed up for the following month's show.
Oh,
I was like, because like, it was a rolling program. And so they were just like, if you're interested, come up to us after the show. Because it had the entire program has like sponsorship money. So like it has funding to be able to cycle through that. But I was just like, sign me up. Let me give this a try. And again, a huge part of that was like being in a new city where nobody knew me and I can be like, whatever the hell I want. So let's give this a go. And they provided some like light training of just like, here's some exercises you can do. Like that sort of thing. And then just like let us fly for 8 to 10 minutes. But that's what got me started. And then it got me thinking about like, oh, all right, what are the other ways that like, what are the other art forms that we can use to communicate science? Like the technical sides of it. And, you know, that scientist brain, I couldn't, and like the logic behind like what's going on and why is it working? Like that, like really sparked that side of my brain too. And so like, that's kind of why I have a very sort of mechanical way of needing to parse out why my set is working or why it's not, or like why it works for certain rooms and why I don't go to certain open mics, but I do prefer to go to certain open mics until I'm ready. And yeah, like that just kind of connected naturally. Cause like stand up is so logical.
Yeah.
It's like a huge part of it is just you unpacking your own logic in your head. Right. And like, it
and
just
then you're just
sense.
A/B testing the whole, like, that's all. It's just that's like, all right, this worked. This joke didn't work. Let me just tweak these 3 different words, see if it hits, if I phrase it this way. Oh, it worked that way. Like, that's all it is.
Or like, let me find a new market for this because this is not the market for it. You know what I mean?
There you go. You know the rooms that you just don't go to because, like, why? What's the point?
Exactly.
So did you stick around in the UK for a while after you finished up your program there? Or did you immediately? Because I mean, we met in New York, so I know that you came back to New York at some point.
Spoiler, I ended up in New York. I mean, I had a student visa. And so that student visa was limited unless I was able to find a job there that would help sponsor a longer visa. But that was actually really difficult because like the job market in the UK and especially in Edinburgh was really small for what I was trying to do. And like I was up against people who had massive connections, right? Or like had been, and also know the sort of culture of how to write a resume and stuff. And like, that was something I learned from one of my good friends who works in HR in the UK. And he was like, and he'd lived in the US too and worked as HR. Different resumes, but also the cover letters. Like the thing that he told me was like, oh, what was it? Oh, he was like, in the US, you have to sort of brag about your accomplishments, right? Like that's kind of the vibe. Whereas in the UK, don't you dare brag. You better tell us, it better be self-deprecating enough. Where you're like, I achieved some stuff, but like I can also grow and like, can you help me? But also like, I would be perfect for it. Like, it was just like such a different vibe that I was not even 2 years into like living there. It was like, no, I'm too much of a New Yorker. Are you kidding me? Like,
I know. Honestly, someone's being like, job? Don't you dare brag is the most British fucking thing I've ever.
Yeah. That needs its own like transition, like needs its own like workshop for applying for jobs there. Because yeah.
I mean, what a mess. So that after your student visa finished up and you got this degree now, you've successfully like beep, 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 backed up and now gone off a different exit. And now you're also doing, you're performing and you're getting more into how comedy and other art forms can help with science communication. So when you land back in New York City, where did you sort of start down that path? Did you have to reckon with the ghosts of your past a little bit, or were you kind of free to just start over?
I've been able to avoid it. Like, I've been able to avoid reckoning with my past for a long time. And I think it's not until like my job now where people are sort of like, I'm crossing paths with people that I was in grad school with and that sort of thing. Cause like I work in science radio. And so like, we've had guests on our shows where like, oh snap, that's like my former classmate. Hey, but also I totally ghosted you when I left grad school. So like totally fine if you don't want to talk, but congratulations. You know what I mean? I think I'm at a place now where I have shown enough proof of my own concept and I'm more open about talking about my mental health issues and like the systemic issues that I was up against that I just felt like wasn't working for me. And I have enough validation from people from my past program to be like, yeah, it was really messed up. Like what we had to go through just to thrive it's weird. So like I have had like somewhat of a closure, but that took a long time to get to. And so just before that, a lot of it was just like, I found a great job with an organization that was doing really, really interesting things with engaging audiences with science. Mm-hmm. And a huge part of that was like being in music festivals, doing like random experiential pop-ups in New York City about like science, and, you know, me being able to randomly produce a show about dating and the science of dating. And like, you know, like things like that, where I was like, I'm still exploring the possibilities, but I'm also asking the question of like, what does it mean to like really connect with the culture and like connect the science? And like parallel to that is also me creatively doing for myself, like what a comedy show can be, where like our main drive is just, you know, to unpack learning, or like to unpack the history of why we think a certain way and that sort of thing. So like, that's what I did, you know, for 2 years at Caveat, this theater in New York City. Like I was doing the symposium academic stand-up, and like a huge part of that was just like this proof of concept that I can make people laugh, but like the sets that people were doing all kind of like talked about one thematic thing, whether it's, you know, like whether it's how sex and gender is so messed up in society, or like whether it's like museums are not actually like neutral spaces, they can be harmful to people of color and like Indigenous folks, like all of these like big thematic things that like I felt, you know, comedy had a power to be able to like really satirize, or like really point, you know, a finger to, and like really like challenge people to rethink about it. Like that allowed me that process. So like that was sort of just for me, but like on the work side, I was able to like see what it was like to bring science pop-ups to an EDM festival where people were like walking around very high and they're like, hey, you know, the science of psychedelics, let's talk about it, and like actually connect with them, you know?
I love that.
We have done some very strange things, but also
let me tell you about the chemicals wandering around your brain right now.
Oh my God. Like the number of people I've met who are like, oh, you know, I microdose and I take notes, and I'm like, dude, that's science. You know what I mean? Like that makes sense. Like, yeah.
That's really cool. And yeah, it is really interesting. I'm a very big believer, in that sort of thing that you were talking about, how like it really, just because it's I guess serious is the wrong word, but just because it's, you know, I guess serious, it doesn't mean it can't be funny. Like, you know, and I'm working on a project myself right now that is I'm developing a sort of travel and culture show that is, I also want it to be funny. And I'm like, I'm creating this treatment and brief for it, and I'm using like geopolitical and like all these words, and I'm like literally typing like, just because I use the word geopolitical doesn't mean it's not going to be funny. Like
right.
People don't want to laugh when they hear that word.
Absolutely.
And I think it's really, I think like we need people doing work like what you're doing to sort of like, I feel like people are just sometimes like just don't want to laugh when they hear like technical terms, and I think that there's a right way to do it, you know. Oh, absolutely. I think it's funny to me because like, you know, that word jargon gets thrown around a lot, and a lot of people hate it, and like sometimes I'm just like, okay, but me using Gen X, Gen Z lingo, you know, like Gen X lingo versus Gen Z lingo are like jargon to each other. You know what I mean? And so like, if I'm talking about swag and bling and stuff like that, where like I have to explain that to somebody else who's older, or like the reverse, like that's all kind of the same. But I think like for me, all of the work that I have done, like kind of showed me that a huge part of that is like really respecting those cultures. And like, what are the words that make sense for those cultures? And then like in our comedy, a huge part of that was like really learning that the times where I thought something was funny, but really dark, but wasn't working in a room, was a signal for me to keep working on it. Because like, I knew there was something really like, you know, powerful, satirizing,
hilarious about that and it's uncomfortable. But that meant I had to do the harder work to get people comfortable and safe enough so that I could push that boundary. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I completely understand that. I mean, I a lot of my stand-up was whenever I first start writing a joke, a lot of my jokes are a bit dark. And then I'm like, oh, you guys hate that? Oh, okay, great.
You're crying?
Yeah.
Oh,
like,
no. Okay.
I don't know how many times on stage I've been like, I'm laughing. You can laugh. I'm laughing. And this is about me. So like, it's fine.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's interesting that you bring up that sort of jargon thing because like I know were you involved in the Code Switch show?
Yeah.
Too?
Yes. So that was something that like right, Lou was our mentor for that, brought a whole bunch of people together. But the shows themselves that were outside of UCB at the time, I produced those shows because
they were at Caveat, weren't they?
They were at Caveat, and so I led the production of those shows because no one at UCB knows how to market anything. So it was just like,
you don't say.
Wow, yeah. And so like I was like, okay, well, if I know that there's going to be an audience for this, so let me take the reins. And like a huge part of that was also pushing our team to be like, okay, how do we tighten this up so there's like a value to the audience that are coming in? So so I ended up leading those shows.
Yeah. It sounds like I saw a couple of those shows when they were running and obviously I understand the concept behind it, but it sounds like there's also like, that is obviously like code switching among race and culture. But then we're also when you're talking about the jargon between like scientists and not scientists, it's almost like you have to some sort of code switching to actually make it understandable. What do you think? How do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, they're parallel. Yeah. And I think people of color definitely understand just how much they have to white speak to be heard in academic spaces or like, you know, just like how much we sort of have to, in order to achieve our end goal, understand how we have to sort of push ourselves back and forth or even get to a place where like we can finally be ourselves and what that means. That's all I think. I've found in my experience that that's all kind of tied together. But code switching is very much like the idea for me of marginalized folks having to play the field, right? Like that's like a huge part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think it definitely gives a unique perspective for anyone who's marginalized in, for example, a gated field like the sciences, already having to like do that code switching, but like double time because it's like science communication too. It's really, really interesting layered stuff. So when you were working on the science symposium show and then also all the other comedy stuff that you were doing, what was the response like immediately? Like there was such a need and you were filling a space, or did you find that it was like you had to build things slowly? What was that experience like?
I had great advice from my friends who started the Bright Club in the UK. And one of the advice was like, you know your value, understand how much time you might need to get that buy-in. Yeah. And so, I knew the owner of Caveat before Caveat was built because we were working in the same circles of science communication, Ben Lilly. Yeah. And so, I had his ear to be able to pitch a concept that had, like proof of concept already outside of the US. And I was like, okay, but to realistically do this in a city where there's no understanding what this market can look like, also, you're just starting out as a space that was originally going to be like, entertainment for like smart thinking entertainment. I need the learning space. So I have a structure. I know who I want to bring to the table. I also know that I need to find those people or train them up. So like I was finding people who I thought had something to say with their comedy and inviting them to like do thematic shows. But then I was also trying to reach out to like academic spaces to like see if I could train up people and like give them that professional development training. Yeah. So I knew that I needed the time to develop because I needed the time to develop the process as a producer. But then I was also, as a marketer, I knew that I needed the time to get that branding and the messaging right so people can find me.
Yeah.
And so that meant I specifically told Ben, give me 2 years to develop. And I know you're working with a lot of different things, but you're also, as a new theater that had a very specific mission, you're also coming up with that challenge, right? And so, because we knew each other, I had that opportunity to sort of design that. But I was one of the original external programs that Caveat did, and I was there for their opening and their soft openings, and up until the pandemic started, March 1st, that was something that I was bringing to the table. Right. And so I baked that into the process. Yeah, because I'd had enough experience as a producer to know, okay, here are all the variables that I still need to figure out, and how much time this will take in a big city that already had a massive market for comedy. I need that time. Yeah.
It's really smart and so important, because a lot of times other venues might be like, oh, well, your first show just didn't really, draw a sold out crowd, so you're out. It's like, well, okay. Give me time.
Yeah, exactly. And learning, also being open enough to understand the venue's needs, right? There are times where I'm I'm not going to take a weekend show. There's no way, because you need that to pay your bills. So let me find a Thursday, let me find a Wednesday and see what I can do there. But yeah, I think, the experience producing for somebody else, or the experience kind of learning through my day job what it meant to market something that was totally unheard of for a new audience, helped me make that pitch to Caveat and Ben Lilly.
Yeah. Very cool. And so throughout the pandemic, science communication has become a huge VIP front of mind important thing in the last 2 years, I feel like.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, and specifically as it relates to your work with, funny comedy science comms?
The pandemic really changed a lot of things. I think, March 1st, Esther, Chen, and I, decided we threw a show about Asian racism, anti-Asian racism, and coronavirus before the virus was even really confirmed to be in New York, right? Yeah. And we didn't foresee that show to necessarily sell out, but how uncomfortable but also exciting it was to have Caveat filled with 140 people. Yeah. For the very last live show of Caveat during that time, but also for me to show proof of concept of the power of comedy, to both laugh and highlight, what anti-Asian racism looks like. Yeah. And also educate people about this incoming fear. And so it was really exciting to sort of do that. However, at the same time, it was also this pressing need to spotlight science, and understanding as a producer, this is only, and a marketer, that this is only happening now because everyone knows and can see and can feel the urgency. Yeah. But that is fleeting. Because so many of the avenues to connect about this thing, once people were saturated with the worries, the, caring about how to wash your hands, then that goes back to the back burner, right? That's not front of mind anymore. And I saw that, and I see that now in terms of, how people either follow science news or talk about research. People are so tired of COVID news stuff, but at the same time, it's still a problem because misinformation is huge in social media. People still don't necessarily know what is a trustable resource, or what it means to no one's ever going to really learn how to read a preprint paper about the recent vaccine research. Yeah. No one has time for that. But at the same time, people haven't necessarily honed in on who's the right people to follow, so I can unpack that. because like Joe Rogan is still the main person for so many people, and he just spouts really terrible things, right?
Really,
and like
fucking
you can't,
stupid.
yeah, and you can't control that, like that, like so. I think yes, for sure, there's been like a really great boost for what science influencers can be like on social media and like people's connections to science. And there's research that has shown that trust in science is still strong, but it's not necessarily the same kind of like lifelong connection, because you're still fighting against the misinformation people of the world, and like just how democratized information is now on social media, right? So I think there's still a lot of work there, but like this past 2 years has only been a tiny experiment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. It's so interesting how all those factors contribute to and what a prescient, very just like incredible to think of you all with that very specific show that you had on that exact date in Caveat in New York City.
Like the time that, like, I think it was like an afternoon. Our show started at 4. People started piling in. It was amazing. We had
March
like a ton
1st
of.
Was the first case
one
in New York.
In New York, yeah.
I remember.
As soon as we got out of the venue, I think around 8:00, I opened, my socials, and it was like Rochester man confirmed, and we're just like, oh no, please don't be Asian. Like, that was the reaction that we had coming out of the thing, and it was just like, okay, yeah.
The timing is just mind-boggling of all of that. And wow. I mean, it's definitely for everything that you do, and specifically your perspective, being who you are and doing what you do. I can't imagine that. Yeah, so I guess my final just thought was just, so like, what do you think, like, kind of, what's the deal now? Like, what is your focus now? What are you most driven to be working on?
I think like you, I've been working a lot on trying to write more during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I actually had a massive like loss of inspiration, because I found out that for myself, a huge part of this process of like seeing how I can insert science into random comedy bits and conversation was interacting with people. Yeah. And during the lockdown, that was impossible. And then, the phases where we were trying to test out how comfortable we are outside, like I got COVID at a bad comedy show. I'm still pissed about it. And like I could have gotten COVID at any other show. It was my first time leaving the house to go support a fundraiser. It was such a bad show that had like racist comedians and sexist comedians. And I'm just like, and I got COVID. And that was for me a catalyst for being like, no, Kyle, I need to focus back on my voice. I need to focus back on my comedy, because like, if this is what's left behind, you know what I mean? After like the pandemic exodus of New York to LA.
It's like, the cockroach effect, right? Like the last thing after the nuclear blast will be the cockroaches.
Exactly. And like that was what the comedy scene felt like when I came back. And that said, there were a lot of great people doing outdoor comedy, right? Like in the parks, but that also meant that the people who were willing to stick around were not the best ones, like not in our eyes anyway. And so I think that was a catalyst for me to be like, all right, let's really focus on writing. When I got fully vaccinated and felt like people were finally checking vaccine cards when they were being together, I felt comfortable enough to sign up again for, a stand-up class. I'd never taken like a proper stand-up class, but I wanted the energy of people in a room that I missed so much. And now that's like, kind of unlocked, sort of a new set for me that I feel really proud of. Like I can visualize what a 30-minute, new show for me could be like with those, characters and stuff, and how I can insert the science in there. And so like, I am in a space now where I'm not producing as much right now, but I'm investing in my own voice and like what I can write. I'm testing out writing I'm learning how to write a TV pilot so that I could turn, all my jokes about the clitoris into like a show, and like, just testing out what I can do with comedy as an art form, like through sketches or through like characters and stand-up. So I think that's where my focus is right now, is myself and my art.
That's great.
And then like, I think next year I'll bring back like other production. So yeah.
That's great. I mean, yes. I mean, especially now everything is so sort of amorphous, and we still sort of have to be a bit not 100% out there. We're still not 100% back. It's the time to do it, to focus on the inner self.
Feed our inner artists.
Yeah. Thank you again, Kyle, so much for joining me on today's episode. It was a pleasure to speak with you, and I really learned so much about you and science communication and that industry and how it relates to comedy and storytelling and digital media and everything that I already dabble in that isn't involved in science. If you'd like to follow Kyle, you can find her on Instagram at Kyle Marian or on Twitter at Kyle Marian, and I'll have links to her profiles in the show notes for today's episode. As for me, I'm Angela Palladino. I've always been Angela Palladino, and next week I will still be Angela Palladino, back with another episode for you of You Gotta Have a Podcast, the season of The Swerve. You can follow me on Instagram at Ange.pal or on Twitter at AngePal, or just Google me. I'm out there. You can find me, or don't. Realistically, if you're listening to this, you probably already know me. Listen, I know my audience. Thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate it. If you're enjoying this season and all the episodes I've been putting together for you, please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to us on. I'd really appreciate it. It would help me a ton. Thank you again for listening. And until next week, I'll talk to you.